Thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar. We hope that the information presented is useful for you. Please consider sharing this resource with other caregivers. Also, please consider making a donation at the end of the presentation so that we can continue to provide these webinars free of charge.
Well, welcome to the Alzheimer's Association Conversations about Dementia. This is a presentation that we have primarily for families, but also friends and acquaintances who are noticing changes in someone, perhaps having changes with their memory, or perhaps needing to talk about changes in their driving ability, or making plans for legal and financial documents. Those are hard conversations for people to have, and this presentation will hopefully provide some tips on how do you have that conversation, what are some things that you can talk about or prepare yourself, because often families find themselves either delaying it or not sure how to approach the subject. In today's program, you'll see some actual video clips of real people who have tried these conversations, and they're going to talk about what that's like. We'll also provide tips on how you can effectively introduce the topic and how you can actually have the conversation. And hopefully you'll also get some ideas of what resources are available to help you, because no one should have to deal with this alone. So sometimes people find themselves delaying the conversation, putting it off, and coming up with different excuses. Someone might say, well, my sister lives close by, she'll take care of it. Or maybe, well, mom's always been independent. She wouldn't want me to get involved. If I step in, she's going to be really offended. Or maybe, it's okay. Dad's doing fine. It's subtle. He's been managing fine. We'll just deal with it later. And this has happened to a friend of mine. She had called me and she said, you know, she noticed some changes in her mother-in-law, but she thought, oh, she's doing fine. You know, she's living alone in her house and she's doing fine. And then one day they went to her house and they opened her refrigerator and found all this food that was moldy. And then they realized she hadn't been eating properly, not eating very much at all for a very long time, and she lost significant weight. And then they had to start looking into moving her into a different type of living situation, looking at long-term care facility. So they delayed this conversation. They could have had the conversation earlier, but they thought, well, she's doing fine. Sometimes you hear the excuses from the person you're concerned about. So the person might say, well, you're busy. This is often something that parents might say. I don't want to bother my children. They're all very busy. I have my own life. I'm fine. Don't worry about it. Or, wait till you get to my age. Then you'll know what it's like. So what are some tips for having the successful conversation? How do you bring up the subject if you're noticing the changes in someone with memory loss? The first thing to really pay attention to, and I think to know, is the sooner the better. Don't delay it. Most of the time, the person who you're concerned about also notices these changes and may have been afraid to talk about it, doesn't want to initiate the conversation. So sometimes it's helpful for you to be the one to initiate it, but you definitely want to have it sooner than later. Don't wait for a crisis. And sometimes families do, but you really want to try and have this conversation earlier. Develop a plan. So you're thinking about this person. Let's say you're thinking about mom. I'm noticing these changes in mom. You think about, how will I have this conversation with her? What words would I use? How would I bring it up to her? How would I finesse it, knowing her personality, knowing how she feels about memory loss, perhaps? How would you bring it up? And someone has brought up, a colleague of mine has had this conversation with her own mother, and she said the way she brought it up was, she asked her mom one day, Mom, if I ever noticed any changes in your functioning, your ability to do daily things, would you want me to tell you? And her mom said, yeah, I'd want to know. And that opened the doors. Well, you know what? You know, she really was able to then kind of talk about it right then and there. Even if the person said, no, I don't want you to tell me, that still opens the doors, because then you could ask, well, why? What are you concerned about? Or what would be your fear? And that would help you maybe broach the subject. So think about how you could finesse the conversation. Take notes about the changes you see. So note for yourself, what are some specific examples or concerns you have? And then when you have the conversation, you can have some specific examples. And talk about it from your perspective, not blaming the person, but I've noticed you've been forgetting names of common objects. Like when we had that conversation and you were trying to come up with the word for the 8-tentacle creature, you couldn't think of the word octopus. You were having trouble. Or when you were talking about the flowers in your garden that you just planted, you were having trouble naming the specific flowers that you had just planted. So those specific examples can be helpful. Practice in advance. So think about the relationship you have with your loved one, or maybe it's a colleague, but think about how would this go? Maybe you role play with a sibling. You might have a different relationship with your parent than your brother or your sister does, and you could role play with your siblings. Okay, you be mom, and I'll pretend like I'm having this conversation with her, and your sibling could say, oh, no, you can't do it like that. She would say this, or she would say that. So you can give some specific, suggestions to each other of what would work for her. You also want to think about the time and place that you're having this conversation, because ideally you both want to be relaxed, or many of you, if it's the whole family, you want to find a time and place when you're all relaxed. If I were having this conversation with my mom, I know I would not want to do it on a weekday after work when I'm tired and it's late, and you want to really be able to be fully present in this conversation. So likely, I'm thinking for myself, maybe I would have it on a Sunday morning over brunch, and most likely at my house, where she's a guest. If it's at her house, I know she would worry about being a good hostess, making sure there's enough food for everyone, making sure that the house is tidy. And so think about for your own family, where's the ideal setting and time to have this kind of a conversation. When we're talking about changes with dementia, they're very different from typical normal aging changes. So examples like examples of things that people have done with ease that become difficult are more in line with the warning signs of dementia. So oftentimes we use this umbrella term dementia that's to describe the changes in cognitive function, including ability to remember things that just happened, and also communication and judgment skills, your ability to follow through with different things. So examples might be managing money. People who have done things with ease and are having trouble with those things, like balancing a checkbook, preparing a meal, remembering appointments, those kinds of things. So it's not, oh, I can't remember things from the past, or I can't remember a lot of the different things that have happened a long time ago. We're talking about things that people do with ease on a daily basis that they're having trouble with. And those are the things that you can bring up as examples when you're having the conversation. because you don't want to use abstract examples, but things that they might notice that they're having trouble with as well. So for example, I noticed that you forgot to pay the bills the last few months, and you're always very timely about paying the bills. What's going on? Or I noticed you forgot your 2 doctor appointments last month, and that doesn't usually happen. So those kinds of examples. So you've noticed the changes, and now you want to get the person to the doctor. You want to get them to see a doctor to find out what's actually going on. Maybe it's not dementia. It could be something else. But the only way to find out is to actually talk to a doctor and to see what's actually going on. Sometimes people are very afraid of this, and they run into many different emotions because, it's a scary prognosis to think that, oh my gosh, do I have dementia? Do I have Alzheimer's disease? Or having to face the changes related to aging. Those are all difficult for folks. Or they might get angry. I don't want to be in this situation. Or it could be just stigma. Not just stigma, but stigma is often a big barrier still. And in some communities, no one talks about memory changes, or no one talks about Alzheimer's, and it's very difficult for families to have to deal with this. So just recognize that different emotions come up, and that this may be part of the reason why people are reluctant to go see a doctor. Donna's going to talk about the importance of getting help. So let me show the video.
I think you have to be honest. I think that's the important thing with it. To get a loved one to the doctor, I think you just need to be candid and honest of what are you trying to do. We're trying to understand what we're up against. It's just so important to do that, because you can't battle something that you don't know what you're battling. Again, it may not have been Alzheimer's, it could have been depression, it could have been so many other things. And guess what? There's other things you can do to take care of those issues as well. But that's what you need to be able to do. You can't ignore something. It's not going to go away.
You can't ignore something that isn't going to go away. And likely, and what happens with Alzheimer's is it's a very gradual onset, and families often don't notice the changes for months or even years. And so to ignore it really exasperates the problem. So it's really important. So you're ready to go to the doctor. How do you have the conversation? How do you encourage the person to go to the doctor, assuming that they aren't all that willing on their own? Think about the words that you're going to use. If the person is very, just has fears about Alzheimer's, there's the stigma around Alzheimer's, maybe you don't want to say, let's go to the doctors and get an assessment to see if it's Alzheimer's disease. Maybe you approach it as, we've noticed these changes. Why don't we go to the doctors and just see what might be attributing to this? Let's just find out what might be causing these changes, and just leave it at that. The other approach might be to suggest the annual wellness visit. So something that is fairly new, it happened, it's been part of the law in 2011, is that Medicare pays for a cognitive screening. For people over 65, they have an annual wellness visit. And in that annual wellness visit, the doctor can do not a diagnosis, a screening, a cognitive screening. So they ask a few questions just to see if it warrants further testing. And so it's not a diagnosis in itself, but just a screening. It's almost like a preventative measure. It's like going to the dentist. You go to the dentist before you have a problem. You go just for preventative measures, to get your teeth clean, just to see if you have cavities. The annual wellness visit is like that. They establish a baseline, and the doctor can see, are there changes over time? And the cognitive screening is part of that. So you can make it more of a neutral, this is just standard practice. But if you're noticing actual changes that warrant further testing, don't wait for the annual wellness visit. Be sure to call the doctor and schedule an appointment before that. Sometimes families find, well, that doesn't work, and you could pair the doctor's visit with an enjoyable outing. So maybe you say, oh, well, we're going to stop and visit the doctors, and then why don't we go out for lunch after? So there's some incentive, something more pleasant to look forward to in addition to visiting the doctors. Encourage other family members to be a part of this conversation. Encourage your siblings or your other parent to actually note things that they've seen that are problematic or a concern. If they have questions for the doctor, gather them all together. You can have more than one person go with you to the doctor's office. Hopefully the person that you're concerned about will allow you to go accompany them. If they don't, that's okay. The important thing is to get the person to the doctor's office. But you want to have your list of questions and concerns ready for the doctor. There are patient-doctor confidentiality regulations, and it means that the doctor can't necessarily tell you about the patient's situation without the patient's consent, but you can certainly convey to the doctor your concerns. So you're free to tell the doctor whatever concerns you have. And if that doesn't work, sometimes we need to resort to a therapeutic fib. Now this is often a last resort. You want to be able to involve the person in getting them to the doctor's office. You want to involve them in this whole process. But sometimes if the person, again, if they have dementia, their judgment is impaired and they may not be so willing to go to the doctor. And so maybe you have to think creatively to get them there, because ultimately this is about their safety and well-being. So a therapeutic fib might look like you get them in the car, you're going to go shopping, and then you say, oh, Mom, I forgot, we have a doctor's appointment. Let's stop at the doctor's and then we'll go shopping. I'm so sorry, we forgot. I had it on my calendar, I meant to tell you, and I completely forgot about it. But we still have time, we could still make it. So you've got the person in the car and you just swing right into the parking lot. Or other therapeutic fibs might be giving an example of, oh, they need to get their prescription filled. And it says that in order to get your prescription filled, you need to go see the doctor. You need to have a checkup before they fill it. They want to just make sure that you still need this prescription. Or maybe you got a letter from the insurance company and it says that you need to have a checkup before they renew the policy. So those are all some ideas of how you might creatively get the person into the doctor's office. Now, after a diagnosis, families often say that the biggest, hardest conversation they have is, when does the person stop driving, or how often are they able to drive? That's the biggest conversation. And I was at a conference recently where one of the audience members said, my mom will not give up driving. We've given up one car, but we still have a family car, and she continues to drive. I can't get her to stop driving. And she's thinking, this is really dangerous because she has Alzheimer's disease. She's in the early stages, but it's still very dangerous. So if you've noticed the person you're concerned about has had mysterious car accidents or nicks and scrapes on the car that they can't explain, or they've had traffic violations that are unexplainable, or you've actually witnessed some mistakes when they're driving, it's probably time to have that conversation. But how do you have that conversation? Driving isn't just about getting from point A to point B. There are a lot of emotions attached to driving. It is a sign of independence that we all take for granted. And if you can't drive, it's often then people are thinking, well, how will I maintain my quality of life? So, just keep that in mind. This is Chris. He's going to talk about how his family needed to ask his father to stop driving.
There's no exact answer on this is when you stop driving. You could tell when coming up to an intersection, as an example, the ability to understand what's going on around you was starting to deteriorate a little bit. Being on the highway with cars on both sides becomes a little bit more difficult. And first and foremost, the safety of everybody in the car as well as other drivers on the road. You think about that and you want to make sure you're not putting anybody in danger. But then the difficult part is telling your dad, who you love, and he loves driving, and he's used to it, that he can no longer do that. But then even then, taking the keys away full time was very difficult. The doctor was very helpful in just saying, medically, you can't do this anymore. But my mother had the hardest time with this because she knew how much this was going to hurt him as well. And this is one of the first things that we had to deal with as a family when it came to telling my dad that he had to stop doing something because of this disease. That meant a lot to him.
It meant a lot to him. Driving is a big deal. And he said he knew that his dad loves driving. I can imagine it would be hard for me to have that conversation with my dad because, he's always been the driver, and my father-in-law used to go on long road trips. I mean, it would be hard for them to give up driving. So the other thing to remember, though, is it's for safety and well-being. And so I'm going to move into some tips for how you finesse that conversation. Again, planning. So have the conversation before an accident occurs. I remember one of our early stage advisory council members, when I asked him, what were some of the first signs you noticed that you might have some cognitive problems? And he said, well, it was my driving. I had all these scrapes on my car because I was making turns and I wasn't quite, making them right. And he himself noticed that he had lots of nicks on his car, and, it was a first indication. He gave up driving readily. It didn't take him any convincing, but that's not always the case. So, express your concern about specific changes you notice. And so we kind of covered that already, noticing some of the changes, being specific again. What are some of the changes that you've noticed? Appeal to the person's sense of responsibility and concern. You say, Dad, I know you take yourself seriously as a responsible citizen, and I know you wouldn't want to harm anyone. You would never want to, be putting other people's lives at risk. And that might be a way to appeal to the person. Sheila talks about having a plan. So think about, what if the person has to give up driving, what would they do to continue their activities? If Dad loves to go play ping pong at the community center, how would he get there if he can't drive himself? How would he, do this? Or how would Mom go grocery shopping or go visit her friends and play bridge? Those are all things that you might want to take into consideration when you're having this conversation. Here's Sheila.
Some tips on having the conversation is pointing out, especially for my father, the potential danger to others that it may cause if he's behind the wheel. And just talking about it from the standpoint that this is not only the best thing for you, but this is also the best thing for others around you. And these are some of the alternatives, making sure that this is what's going to happen, having a plan. If mom can't take you, then Uncle Thomas or will be here to take you, and we will make sure that you're getting out of the house and that you're doing some things. So, presenting the bad news, but then also presenting the plan. And for my father, that's really, really important to have a plan.
That's a great example. She actually presented some suggestions. Well, Uncle Thomas could take you, or this, someone could take you. So it didn't feel like I was giving things up altogether. Maybe it's retiring from driving rather than having to relinquish it altogether. So offering alternate plans for transportation. I'll share an example with you. A friend of mine, when his dad had Alzheimer's, and they noticed quickly, the family knows very quickly, he needed to give up driving, but he was not willing to give up the keys. They tried all kinds of things. There are different creative things people have done, which is, doing something with the engine so you can't start it, or hiding the keys, but he managed to always find a way to get that car started. He'd call a mechanic over and get the car started. What they ended up doing that really worked was the mom had her own, they bought the mom her own new car. She had a brand new car, and so whenever they had to go somewhere, they'd say, oh, well, let's go in Mom's car. And he knew that, oh, that's Mom's car, so I'm not going to drive that. And so if it was his car, he would insist on driving, but if it's the wife's car, said, oh, well, you can drive. So they would always take her car, and they solved that, and eventually they got rid of his car. Maybe an expensive plan, but it worked for them. The other option is to incorporate another authoritative figure. So actually, in California and many states, there is a law where if someone is actually diagnosed with Alzheimer's, the physician has to alert the DMV. And so once the DMV gets the letter, they may ask the person to come in for a driving test. So that sometimes helps, that they have a letter from the DMV and maybe the person doesn't pass the test. But sometimes if the person does pass, the family asks, well, what do I do now? Because the person passed and I'm still concerned about her driving. There is a program called the Senior Ombudsman Program. And this is a program that the DMV has, not everywhere, but you might want to check if yours does, where they are trying to work with the community and trying to help seniors drive independently for as long as possible. So it's an individual, an officer that you can communicate with and say, I'm not sure how long Dad can keep driving. He passed his test. Maybe what they'll do is initiate another exam in a couple months, or they might limit his driving, just the terms for his ability to drive. So there are lots of different ways that the Ombudsman program can help. So that might be another option, and certainly, using that to your advantage. Here's Wendy talking about how you would use empathy in having this conversation.
Talking to somebody about stopping driving, I think it's most important to understand that that is tied to someone's independence more than most things. And so by saying you can't do this anymore is like telling the person, it's like ripping away their independence. And that doesn't feel good for anybody. I know that I've always tried to put myself in that situation. what would I think if someone was saying this to me? You don't get to do this anymore. And how would I feel? And how would I want somebody to talk to me about this? And so if you try to I think sometimes too many people try to approach it as, very punitive. And I'm doing what's right for you. So why don't you understand, without really turning the tables and putting themselves in that position, understanding, how helpless that feels to take those things away. It's important to be thoughtful about what that experience is like for the individual.
Absolutely. I would be at a loss if I suddenly couldn't drive, and I would really, I'd wonder, how would I get to places? How will I do all these things? So that's an important reminder. The other thing that has worked for some people, when the person you're concerned about says, I have been a great driver for 40, 50 years. You can't tell me I can't drive anymore. And the appeal might be, yes, you have been an excellent driver all these years, but you also didn't have Alzheimer's. You have Alzheimer's now, and that really changes your ability to drive. So just reminding them that, Alzheimer's is the reason why we're all concerned. The other thing is, keeping in mind that it does impair one's judgment. So they're not always able to make that decision and know with just knowing that it's not safe for them anymore. They might still think that they're able to drive perfectly. So moving into independence. Driving is something we do that's associated with being independent. Making legal and financial plans has enabled people to live out their retirement very comfortably, just even being able to retire. It gives them options and choices. But with Alzheimer's, it's often very expensive. Alzheimer's is a very expensive disease for families, for the individual, and also for our nation. It costs Medicare 3 times as much to care for someone with Alzheimer's than it does for someone without Alzheimer's. But families often pay a large toll for the cost of taking care of someone. Chris is going to talk about dealing with the financial costs of Alzheimer's.
Financially, this disease will increase the cost of living. It's just a fact. So planning for those extra costs is that much more important than what you were planning for before. And so you have to review everything that's in place, see what changes need to be made, both legally and financially, and you have to monitor that going forward afterwards too.
Okay. Now this is a very tough conversation for families to have. Again, we have these roles in the family. The parent has taken care of everything financially. They have everything in place. We don't talk about wills, and we don't talk about, power of attorney, advance directives. It's just not something many families talk about out in the open on Christmas Day. When someone has Alzheimer's disease, these things become increasingly important because you want to involve the person with this diagnosis. You want to include their voice in plans that you're making for that person. And this disease could last 8 to 10 years. That's a very long time to think about who's going to help care for the person, who's going to pay for this care, how will we manage, and not knowing how long this might last. And to make sure that the person can live with as much quality of life as possible. So it's really important to think about it up front. But what people experience is just this reluctance. Well, I feel like I'm intruding. I feel like I'm going to offend my dad if I'm, trying to find out about his bank accounts or how much money he's got in place. He doesn't usually share this information, or it just feels disrespectful. Julie's going to talk. She's going to give some advice about how would she approach it?
Here's what I've come to after all of this. That it's the most loving and kind thing you can do for them is to be honest with them and say, this is like a really scary thing. And I feel a lot of discomfort bringing this up to you, but you know, I tell them, if you're going to be the one who's going to take them on this journey, then you have to tell them, I'm going to be here on this journey with you. And there are things that we have to do to get this in place. We're going to go on this journey together. I've told you I'm going to be here with you till the end. So let's get this ready. It's like we're going to go on an ocean ship. We've got to get things packed up. We've got to figure out what we're taking with us. We got to get ready. And the things that we have to get ready, we have to make sure that we know which doctors you're going to be using. I need to get this signed, okay? So that if you go in there and they have to do surgery, for example, I got to have this durable power of attorney for health care for you. I have to have this worked out, okay? Now, if for some reason, okay, you need to go to rehab after something, I have to have these documents here, the financial stuff, so I can get these things taken care of for you while this is going on. I don't want to have anything get in the way of us being able to progress and keep doing this. I said, it seems hard because it's hard in our heads. You know, everybody's heard, read about people who've stolen from elderly people, who've done these horrible things. But if you're the person who's approaching this with loving kindness and compassion, and you're willing to take this person on this journey, you're not doing a bad thing. You're doing the right thing by talking to them about it. And you approach it from the standpoint of, I'm here for you. I'm doing this for you. We're going to do this together. And I'm going to help you through this. And these are the tools that I need to make sure that we can do this.
I love Julie. Don't you wish you could just take her with you to have these conversations? I love her ocean ship analogy. It's a great analogy. Okay, we got to pack our bags. We got to do this. Giving examples of what if you have to go into surgery? You know, things outside the norm, you know, that might be expected. Those are great examples. So you want to begin by explaining that you're in it together. That's her big message. We are in it together. I'm here with you, assuring the person that you are there because you care. The next one is to start by asking questions and gathering documents. It's a heavy topic. There are lots of different things to consider. You know, finding out, for example, if the person has a will. Do they have a trust? Well, where do you keep copies of this? Who has these copies? Is there an attorney who has a copy? But do a fact-finding mission. Another way to approach it is explain that these are standard procedures. These are standard documents and plans that all of us should be talking about and doing as we get older. And even in, you know, after having kids, people should have a will. I mean, these are all things that any of us should have, and including an advanced care directive. Again, though, it's a very intense conversation for families, and so you can't plan to have it all in one setting. Maybe it's when you go out to visit mom over Christmas break, and you have a little bit of the conversation, and then maybe you plan on having it again in a week or two over the phone. Perhaps you involve other family members in this conversation, but just plan that you might have to break it up. It's not something you can expect to get it all done in one time. Because other questions come up for this person. You know, you're talking about, perhaps when you're talking about advanced care directives, you're talking about, well, what would you want to do in case you need a feeding tube or end-of-life care decisions? These are things people don't like to think about all the time. So just know that it's a lot. You want to involve others as needed. Make sure that other family members are included in this conversation, but also think about if there are any professionals that should be included. Is there an attorney? Is there particularly an elder law attorney, or is there a financial advisor? Is there other professionals to think about? So that kind of moves me into the care team. It's not something you want to do alone, but from start to finish, from the moment you get a diagnosis and throughout the journey, it's never something that one person should be responsible for. So you want to build a care team, a group of people that will help you manage all of this, emotionally, financially, and just, support. Julie is going to talk again about helping to provide care.
Whatever family dynamics exist when you're growing up, they do not magically go away when you become an adult. Even if all your family members go through therapy and they work on these things, under the stress of caregiving for a parent and watching a parent go through the dementia of this disease, those dynamics can still arise. So being able to communicate clearly with your family members about what's going on, the needs primarily of the person you're caring for, like my mother, were most important, inviting them to participate, and where necessary to specifically ask them for help is important. Not to hint, not to wish, not to hope that someone's going to come through and help you without making those requests. It isn't going to work.
So really, you got to be proactive about this. Don't just sit on the sidelines waiting someone's going to come through. It's true, though, this is often something that brings up, old family dynamics. It's sometimes easier to deal with someone else's family than it is your own family. And so you can involve a professional to help you facilitate those conversations, as well as, manage all the documents, manage, process for becoming eligible for Medi-Cal or all those things. But really think about involving other people. So that was the family. And then the medical team, I'm going to go back. So the medical team, you have your primary care physician who often presents the diagnosis. But beyond that, you want to think about, are there other medical professionals who will help steer you in the right direction to other resources? Is there someone who will help manage the whole care? So for example, if the person does need surgery or needs rehabilitation or needs follow-up appointments, as simple as that, is there someone else that you can communicate with to keep the person on track? So maybe it's a medical social worker, maybe it's a physician assistant, but ask if there are other medical professionals that you can communicate with. Peers are also important. So just thinking about, your own friends and your network of people that you can talk to just about how you're feeling, because you may not want to divulge how overwhelming this is to mom that you're caring for, but you have your own feelings that you're dealing with, and so you want to be able to confide in other people. Patty is going to talk about a program called All's Connected.
Just even having someone to talk to who understands the issues, or even online, the Alzheimer's Association has different ways that you can connect with other people who are going through your same experiences, because you don't have to then give them the background of, they know, they understand, they know what your emotions are when you observe your loved one sort of take a little bit of a mental dive. You don't have to go through that with them. They understand what you're going through, and just to be able to talk with someone or vent. And there's so many feelings. There's so many feelings. There's guilt, there's anger, there's all these things that you have to deal with. And it's important.
I have talked to so many family members who think they are all alone in dealing with this, and they're not. There are so many other people, unfortunately, who are dealing with this, but other people who can give perspective and insight and relate to how you're feeling and how you're coping. So All's Connected is a great program where if you only have time at 3 in the morning to be able to connect with someone else, there are other caregivers out there on this message board that you can ask questions about anything, and someone is likely to be able to relate to your situation. The workplace. So the workplace, often many caregivers are still working, and that's a place where you can also think about tapping into resources. It's really encouraged to maybe ask the HR department, what caregiver benefits there might be. Is there an employee assistance program? But think about the workplace as also potential support. And this is Porvi again, who talks about how employers can be helpful.
What I've learned as an HR professional and what an employee should be able to have as a conversation with their employer is the trust to ask for what they need. All they can say is no. And so it's important to start the conversation and understand what policies exist, but also recognize that if you have a solid relationship with your manager, they'll work through what those policies are to find the best solution for you, but also for on our side as employees to realize that they're doing their best to come up with that solution. And it may not be the exact solve in the first pass, but keeping with it as you go through your process is important. So this connects to why it's important to talk to them in the early diagnosis of Alzheimer's with a loved one, because it takes time to understand what you need, but it also takes time to educate your employer on how they can support you. So keeping that conversation alive is great. Using all the resources that an employer provides is also key. So if one isn't comfortable talking directly to your manager, of course, many companies have employee assistance programs and other benefits where you can turn to and get assistance as well. And so it's important to use all that an employer is providing you. But 9 out of 10, I think employers are willing to help in the best way that they can.
The other thing to think about is Family Medical Leave Act, which can, allows parents to go on extended leave for child care when they have a new baby or a newly adopted child. This also covers caring for a dependent such as a parent. So think about that as another resource. So community resources. What's out there in the community? Often people have not looked into this until they really have to. And community resources, you'd be surprised, there is a lot out there. There are many different types of services and programs that can be helpful. This is Raul, who's going to talk about how he found community resources, particularly the Alzheimer's Navigator, helpful.
The Alzheimer's Association provides a website where I start to look into resources. My siblings find out that in their own time they could visit the website. We find out support for us to not only learn about the disease, but about how to have a place, to find resources on the website. And my older brother visited the Alzheimer's Navigator. He's the one who started looking on and then told us to go there. We started looking into the resources that were available. Even though we live in a different country, we speak a different language, but the toolkit that is there, the things that we came out with, are extremely helpful for us, because by ourselves we cannot really put in place a care plan. Really, it takes an emotional toll for us to do that. So we got a lot of help from the Alzheimer's Navigator in terms of having a care plan in place, and that was really a great tool for us.
So the Alzheimer's Navigator is essentially an online program that will help you think about what are some plans, what are some questions and considerations to have as as you go along. And if you don't already know this stuff, you're not a social worker, you're not a gerontologist, it's a great program to look into. And how great that he and his brother who lives in another country can come together with this. There are other programs that, so be on the lookout, because a lot of companies or startups are looking at apps to help caregivers. We have this burgeoning aging baby boomer population, and as people are getting creative with trying to figure out apps that make people's lives easier, this is an area that is also growing, to look at how to help caregivers do things with greater ease, coordinating plans with other family members, calendars, and just looking for resources. So there's a lot out there. Know that you can contact the Alzheimer's Association as your starting place to find out what is out there, and we can help you. We can help you, kind of field some of those questions you have in mind. If you're just starting the conversation, I think my mom has memory loss, it might be Alzheimer's, but I'm not sure. How would I do this? Or maybe you need to find a doctor in your area who does do a diagnosis, or maybe you're needing a dentist, or you're needing daycare center. Whatever the question is, you can always call the Alzheimer's Association. You can also look on our website for more information. I did a presentation recently, and this woman raised her hand and she said, my mom had Alzheimer's, and back then there wasn't really much out there. I really had to just do it all by myself. And how awesome it is now that there's so many different services and so many resources. So I do encourage you to seek us out. That concludes our presentation on conversations about dementia. Again, feel free to call our 24-hour, 7 days a week helpline, and you can always check out our website. If you have any questions, feel free to contact us. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this informative webinar. We'd love to continue providing these webinars free of charge, so please consider making a donation at the link below.